Hello everyone, good morning. And first and foremost, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Luca, for this wonderful introduction. You mentioned the CEO, and I want to emphasize that I'm still one of those who graduated in Budapest, and I think it's going to be, unfortunately, a very different experience for people after us. But CU is now in Vienna, and that's how it is. And I'm extremely happy to be here. And I was thinking, coming on the way, driving actually from Vienna here to Zagreb, about how the locality where I talk about my work puts me into a very different position and makes me think about different aspects. I'm usually elsewhere. I'm the person who explains Yugoslavia to Czechs and Poles and Slovaks and Hungarians or to Westerners. And it's, of course, a very different story when I talk about this here. And I'm a bit nervous, also touched. Hopefully I won't cry. But it's coming this project home. It's like when the book was published and I felt that, okay, it's coming back here where it belongs. And at the very same time, I also very strongly believe that this is a shared story for East and Central Europeans. And I will talk about this a little bit more because coming from this Central European background and having been socialized through a very Central European post-1989 narrative, both academically and politically, puts this story of feminism in Yugoslavia into a very different framework for me. In the post-89 era, and some of you may know this, some of you may not, it was flooded with essays and academic journal articles with titles such as, "Why do we not have feminism? Do we need feminism? What is feminism?" And women and men as well had very little exposure to feminist ideas, to feminist theory outside the English and American studies departments, which had a little bit more access. When I presented about this, about my project in Prague, there was a scholar, Adela Judicova. She's also a historian of 20th century Czechoslovakia and women's history. And she told me how one of the famous dissidents of the time, Jiřina Šiklova, whose name may be familiar to many of you, told her that she actually wanted to work on feminism, but she tried to bring back some books from abroad from a conference, and those were confiscated at the border. And of course, this is one aspect of the story of how Yugoslavia became this unique hub of feminist thought at the time. But I also think that it's very important to look at this phenomenon, the missing feminist story from 70s and 80s Central Europe, in a more multi-layered way, and to go beyond this very simple party state dominated the woman question, and there was an authoritarian regime, and it didn't let anything intellectually interesting to happen, because this was not the case. Because you have a super fascinating dissident intellectual scene in these countries, and this is something that made these countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, much more present in the history of political thought research after 89. But there is no feminism. And at the same time, it would be, I think that what the Yugoslav story does is that it helps us to overcome this issue that we constantly just talk about, the lack, the void, the missing something, and to see, okay, there is another country where there is feminism, and why don't we treat this story as a shared one? Blaženka Despot, whose name is probably familiar to everyone in this room and on Teams, wrote in her seminal, The Woman Question and Socialist Self-Management, quote, "Within philosophy before Hegel, it is not even possible to raise the woman question. If philosophers before Hegel, that is, metaphysicians, say something about women, they say it entirely privately. When they make vitriolic remarks about women, such as Schopenhauer, they say it from their unfortunate experiences with women, from their political and religious beliefs, that is, from something that is heteronomous to the matter itself. These opinions have nothing to do with their philosophy, because in metaphysical philosophy, no philosophical relationship with women is possible. And this is an amazing quote, and she very, to me fascinatingly, is reflecting on this emerging literature in the West, which comes in with a feminist turn in the 70s, and women's studies and feminist scholarship beginning in different departments in the US and Western Europe. And something that scholars are doing is critically reading the canon, the philosophical canon, showing mostly through a gendered analysis, misogyny, and ways women's oppression is conceptualized in this work, which was very empowering, but and politically important, and set the ground for feminist philosophy, a new kind of feminist philosophy. But at the same time, there is something less productive, slightly historical, decontextualized about it. And that's what already in the book that was published in 1987 shows how another kind of research can be done. And I will get back to her in a little bit, but why I started with this quote by her is because in this quote, she is claiming space for scholarly rigor and a clear delineation of traditions and trajectories. And I think that for us, in order to understand better the relationship between Marxism and, more broadly speaking, socialism and feminism after 1945, we need to take the experiences of women in real existing socialist regimes.
Are still on the first slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have just some pictures. I have very just entertaining slides. So yeah, so to understand this story, we need to take the experiences of women in these countries very seriously, and then Yugoslav feminism offers us a lens and analytical knowledge to do this kind of understanding and to do this kind of negotiations. Because of this scholarly rigor and conceptual precision, I think that this story is very important. And today, I will focus on the work of Blaženka Despot and Natalia Sofronic. It's something that I'm trying to develop after my book, because I felt that there was not enough room in the book to focus enough on their work. And I also have to admit that I'm not as far ahead with this project as I should be, because it became a side project in light of the fact that I have to work on also a new topic simultaneously. And before I continue, I would also like to emphasize that, as you know, this scene at the time had a lot of super interesting and very important other philosophers, and Nadezhda Chachinovic on Teams is one of them, but also Rada Ivelkovic should be mentioned, and also the other social theorists, literary scholars, artists whom I don't have time now to speak about, but they should be on our minds, at least in the back of our minds. Here. And I chose these two authors in order to explore the role of consciousness and the role of violence and class in their formulation of feminist claims. Also because we are in the middle of the 16 days against violence against women action days, and it's on my end also a way to remember all those activists and intellectuals and everyday women who have been fighting against violence against women for a very long time. I also have to tell you, but you probably know it, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian. So my methodology is coming from history of political thought, intellectual history, and I use a broader range of sources, and I'm also less well-versed in philosophy than those of you who are actually philosophers. So these somehow it's not moving.
It's stuck. Wait a second. The presentation is.
Maybe now. That's okay. So these are the two books I want to focus on, and it also had to be emphasized that these books were published in the late 80s, but they represent work developed over more than a decade. And when I realized that we have a couple of participants who are not from former Yugoslavia, I thought that I will just give a very short intro also about what this 1970s and 1980s was about from the feminist perspective in Yugoslavia. And also to explain a bit why I call it new Yugoslav feminism. It's new in the sense that there was feminism already before this period, but it's also neo-feminism is one of the terms that the participants used to use about themselves. And it's also very frequent with this reemergence or the strengthening of feminist activism and thinking in the West. This is something that we very often call the second wave, which of course is a very problematic term, but the self-designation of the time was also in the West very often new feminism. So I use this to differentiate this from other feminist movements, other forms of feminist thought. Just to make this clear, it starts in the early 1970s. It's also very important that there are these two very symbolic events, 1976 in Portorož and 1978, the big conference, Drukca Žena, Comrades Women in Belgrade. But these were preceded by publications, by discussions, from the early 70s on, and the centers are the universities in Zagreb, Ljubljana, and Belgrade, but also the student cultural centers and the sociological society here in Zagreb. There are multiple publications in different journals. I just brought a couple of these just to show how rich this scene was. If I have to sum up what this feminist discourse at the time was about, it's important to say that the authors who were not only academics, but also writers, artists, journalists, and later activists, they argue from a feminist perspective, from a feminist base, but their feminist argument is infused by critical Marxism, post-structuralist French feminism, new theories in psychology, including the anti-psychiatry movement, anthropology and sociology, and they are very much engaged with the Yugoslav partisan tradition as an emancipatory ideology for women. So this is the context, and these are the journals, and this is very briefly what's going on. And it is in one of these journals in 1978 that the social theorist Natalia Softanic from Sarajevo published her ideas about how feminism can be relevant in this socialist context. And she gives a very I'm just seeing that people are trying to enter. Oh, you have that. Okay. Sorry. So she writes in her essay in the journal Pitanja in 78, quote, throughout the 1,000-year-long oppression of women, women could maintain a relatively autonomous position, while they had to obey those in power, fit into the system and the existing order. While doing so, they remained in opposition, and they managed to preserve an inner, a different sociability in themselves with the help of psychological resistance and by constantly reminding themselves of their dissatisfactory position. And this is, to me, this quote is crucial because she refers to this long tradition of this long heritage of patriarchy, which will become important later, and I will get back to this. But also because the concept of consciousness and self-consciousness is so so central in her thought throughout her work in this time of the 70s and 80s. And the readings of Marxist texts in her work get a psychological perspective, which strengthens the possibilities to reconsider the role of consciousness in the new feminist discourse and in new feminist politics at the time. The concept of consciousness returns in a way to the Yugoslav feminist discussions from a detour, not only from psychology, but also how the radical feminists in the US borrowed the Marxian concept for the grassroots activism and give the concept of feminist meaning. I'm sure the consciousness raising groups is a concept that is familiar to everyone. So this was this moment when the feminists in socialist Yugoslavia take the concept back through most of the work of ZSOFIA LÓRÁND, who in 1981 wrote, quote, "The radicalization of women's consciousness lies in their awareness of their own subordination and exploitation in private life and in their interpersonal relations." This is from 1980. The emphasis here is on the possibilities of reaching and developing women's consciousness based on the acknowledgement that there are different types of oppression, which may require different qualities and depth of revolutionary praxis. And revolutionary praxis is one of the concepts that ZSOFIA LÓRÁND uses. For a discourse on consciousness and alienation, she turns to especially the psychological aspects in the work of Lukács and in Lefebvre. She connects her argument that since patriarchy existed before capitalism, women's inequality cannot be resolved in the mere dissolution of capitalism and difference, and class difference. And she changes essentially the landscape of the class versus gender debate through and claims that the workers' movement itself could be revolutionized further if they took women's liberation, women's equality seriously. And there is another quote from her that I brought. There is no equality among unequal parties, and understanding women's subordination leads to a deeper quality of class consciousness. So she moves the discussion of consciousness from the socioeconomic terrain into a psychological direction and moves her text towards the role of the personal. She takes the questions about the personal, the intimate, or human happiness, as she calls it, back into this socialist discussion about women's place in society. And she reminds us that those days are not far when even these, quote, were qualified, bourgeois, and counter-revolutionary, and still today, the significant question about the relationship between socialism and the sexual revolution invokes uneasiness, ridicule, and often even aggression. she's promoting, she's not only writing philosophy, right? She's promoting societal change, and for the sake of that change, she politicizes the personal, rejecting it being solely a bourgeois matter. And she asks this very provocative question, quote, if women are naturally subordinate, why is there all the socialization to keep them in that position? So just to sum up this part about her, she has this discourse-changing and conceptually changing approach to consciousness and self-consciousness. And she also uses the argument about women and women's equality and women's position to still acknowledge the class struggle, but to show how these are essentially codependent. She also makes very important claims about nature and how the relationship of women and nature, what the role of nature is when we talk about women. And she's very much against what she calls the new mystification of the sexual essence of women. And she very much denounces any bioessentialist arguments as counterproductive in her discussion about women and their rights. And this brings her together very nicely with Blaženka Despot, who talks about these very same issues from a different angle. You very well know who Blaženka Despot was. I don't have to introduce her in this room, but maybe for those who are listening and don't know, she was a philosopher. She was born in 1930, which is important because she was already a professor at the time in the 70s when mostly otherwise young women started to explore the possibilities of a feminist discourse and the feminist movement in Yugoslavia. She was an expert in Marx and Hegel, and she gets engaged with new feminist theory through her encounter with these texts, also via her own students, or at least a generation of women who could be her students, or even daughters. She, in her work, starting in the late 70s, rereading essentially Hegel and Marx through the lens of feminism, she heavily focuses also on the issue of nature and its interpretation both by Hegel and Marx. And the other concept that's crucial for her is the concept of time. Focusing on these two concepts helps to get a better understanding of women's status and women's lived experience in socialism. These issues also enable, and using Marx and Hegel enabled Despot to argue that the woman question has to be reopened. And she argued in a need for a well-grounded theory, one that then later can be turned into practice. And one of the concepts that she very concisely tackles and that helps her develop her argument about what is wrong and what is missing in the socialist Yugoslav socialist story about women's emancipation is the concept of the working mother. She argued that the concept of the woman being was replaced by that of the mother, and this prioritizes women's reproductive role and therefore women's nature over anything else. In the dialectic of nature and society, if nature is seen as the eternal and never changing, and, quote, is attributed a secondary significance in society's value system, then the inference to be drawn is that all that is biological, natural, ahistorical, female is regarded as being a lower value, argues Despot. She said that this is a very dangerous idea because, quote, to confine history to historical beings who are, to a lesser extent, conditioned by nature is an absolute scientific premise for racism. And she and Gordana Bosanac both frequently use the term male racism or sex-based racism to talk about patriarchy and to talk about women's oppression, which of course is a very smart move in the non-aligned Yugoslav socialist context, where racism is clearly seen as something unacceptable. This move, yes, and she dispels this idea through her analysis that nature itself is never changing, and for this she uses Marx's own argument, who claims that nature does change over time, and argues that if the human relationship to nature changes over time, then nature itself can change over time. And therefore, nature cannot be a determining constant anymore, and neither should be the nature of woman. This concept of the working mother helps her to develop her other key concept and to critically approach it, which is time. And she relies heavily on Marxist concepts of abstract and concrete work in order to reconceptualize what she considered a neglected concept of domestic work. And work and time being intertwined, she argues that women do not have time to be engaged in politics, to essentially fulfill the possibilities offered on paper by the legislation of Yugoslav self-management because of this attitude to the nature of women. She writes that despite the possibility of self-management, to a new attitude to nature, to the division of labor, the state and authoritarian relations as a whole, women are still on the margins of decision-making. And she develops these ideas further and further in her book, The Woman Question and Socialist Self-Management. And she argues that women's lack of time, due to this old way of reducing them to the reproductive role through this concept of motherhood, is tied together with the phenomenon of domestic violence even. This quote is in her essay, which I haven't, it's from an essay, and I'm not sure it's part of her book, but she writes, and this is, besides the question of the participation in the new historical change of attitude to nature, a participation shared with the entire working class of Yugoslavia, women also have a specific problem, a restricted participation in historical events in the sphere of self-management. Self-managers beat their wives too, a proof of the old relationship to nature. And then she continues, the old authoritarian attitude to the division of labor to nature, authoritarian relations within the family and society mainly affect women because she does not have the time for acquiring skills, becoming involved in politics and science on account of the traditional values of the traditional division of labor. I realize that this way I'm explaining this is becoming a little bit tautological, but I also very much want to show you, I'm trying to show you through my not that wonderful translations of Despot's work into English, how complicated the way she does this argument. And she develops this idea that reducing the matter of women's emancipation to the class question excludes and ignores the issue of violence and the violation of the body, which on the other hand, and here she again turns to Hegel, in Hegel is considered worse than an attack on private property, and which Hegel himself sees as a prerequisite of freedom, like freedom from violence is a prerequisite of freedom and the prevention, a way of prevention of slavery. So this is a very decisive moment in her argument, and she goes even further in her book, where she gives the reader a typology of different types of violence against women, and it's interesting that in the book she doesn't use this kind of new feminist language about violence against women, but it's clear that it is there because it is already on her intellectual horizon. This is the time, and I will talk about that a little bit also. This is the time when organizing against violence against women becomes important and very visible for the feminist groups in former Yugoslavia. It's also the topic that gives them much more visibility. And it is beautiful how in the philosophical work of Despot, this activist consideration, activist agenda gets introduced and organically integrated. So she puts together these different forms of violence against women, which is very much in sync of the typology that is used even today in the discourse of violence against women, or even in the Istanbul Treaty. This is what activists are arguing that legislation should entail, and it's there in Despot and in her work. And she says that that this is again something that's heavily an oversight if we reduce Marxism to the class issue, and if we reduce the woman question from a Marxist perspective to the class issue, and we say that general human emancipation is going to resolve the woman question as well, and that and this is very much at the center of the official discourse in the women's rights discourse in Yugoslavia, that we should focus on opća ljudska emancipacija, general human emancipation, and that's going to work for everybody. And compared to this, Despot says that first, for Hegel, there is this issue about the threat to the body, which is a greater threat to freedom than the threat to private property, and that women, quote, who have been advancing in their awareness of freedom over time, recognize their body as predmet. So I think that's object and subject simultaneously here, as predmet of their freedom, and consider any bodily threat to them through beatings, rape, control over reproduction, fertility, verbal offenses against the female body, and sexuality as an attack on their freedom gained and their relative independence. And it yes, end of quote. So this is her argument developed towards the end of her book. And this is something that, as I said, ties her philosophical work together very beautifully with the activist story going on. It's something that I would never be able to tell for sure, because Despot is someone who in her work is very rigorous in terms of relying on intellectual sources. So it's difficult to prove directly based on her references how much this was influential, but you can see how these topics appear simultaneously and together. For example, just to show you one thing from this activist scene, and you may know this very well, but it's one of the most important forms of research that was done about women's position and violence against women, especially in Yugoslavia in the late 80s. It was done in Belgrade, but at this time, the groups in Belgrade, Ljubljana, and Zagreb are in very close connection, and especially developing their activism and their feminist methodology about violence against women is very heavily entangled, and it's a very important exchange and learning process through exchange across the cities. So they asked women on Women's Day for 3 consecutive years in one of the central places of Belgrade. First time in Terazija, then Kalenic Piazza, and then at the main railway station, which doesn't exist anymore, quite absurdly. And they focused on 3 different issues. So there is actually a very strong sociological grounding in the questionnaires they put together, and they are very nicely preserved. When I looked at them, they were in a suburb of the Ženska Info, and the Žindok Center had its office in one of the suburbs of Belgrade, but by now they are luckily at the university in the Women's Studies Library. And the 3 focal points, first year it was about how women saw their relationship to men and how they saw the issue of equality, which allowed for a rather free way for women to express their dissatisfaction of their position. The second was about what women thought about solidarity among women, where the main line of the findings was that that women realize that there is not enough solidarity and they would crave more, but it's not clear how that should happen. And this was clearly something that that was at the core of feminist thinking of the time, and how to build a more grassroots movement coming from this kind of ivory tower of academia and art and literature. How to turn this more grassroots. And then the third time was about women's health and violence against women. And this is also something that I would mention, that these 2 concepts were very strongly entangled and intertwined. And this is what is also important in the work of Despot, that when she talks about violence against women, she mentions control of women's, actually she talks about women's fertility. So she uses a broad term, which is not only about abortion, but all kinds of ways in all kinds of ways that women's fertility exists, is controlled. And if you look today, because at this point we have reproductive technologies much more developed than they were in the 70s, obviously. But if you look at regimes that control abortion, they also control and restrict artificial reproductive methods and access to them. And this is there already. It's there in the philosophy of Despot, and it's there in the activism. And it continues also through the creation of the first SOS helplines, 88 in Zagreb, 89 in Ljubljana, and I think 1990 in Belgrade. And I wanted to, after talking about these wonderful philosophers, I wanted to also bring in Vesna Mimica, whom you also probably know here in Zagreb. It's important that she was a ballet dancer, and she became one of the she took it on herself to be at the forefront of discussing violence against women in the public, and she used her own experience and her own case exactly because her case was politically very powerful, and there is this beautiful, young, strong woman. And that it even happens to her, that violence against women happens to educated, young, beautiful women. It's not something that old, ugly people in the villages do to each other, which it used to be and still is the very common misunderstanding about this. So I would conclude this talk with showing her image, and just to show through her image also how these very important philosophical discussions developed by people such as Nadella Soflanic and Blaženka Despot were also in heavy dialogue with politics and with activism. But also the reason why I thought that we should definitely look at these sources and to talk about violence against women here and through this story is because what, to my mind, Despot and Soflanic's philosophy does is that they talk about violence against women, and of course they talk about victimization, but they use this to develop something that calls for action, that makes women active, that makes women claim agency and to move forward politically, and that it happens here very beautifully simultaneously. And how also this interference between activism and philosophy leads to a different and very special kind of knowledge production. And just one more thing to say about how I think this story about Yugoslav feminism is more important than ever is that it offers a critique of state socialism, but with an understanding of the regime and with a deeply rooted socialist engagement and a sense of social justice that's not just about class inequality, that goes beyond that. And it's also a critique that does not buy into the Cold War dictated totalitarian narrative as a framework to understand the region. And through this, it avoids self-colonization without sliding into nostalgia. And it still remains strictly critical and offers an alternative. And I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to that.